Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School.
What if God left us? What if God were nowhere near us? What would the world be like? You'd probably be describing hell. That's the only place you can go where God isn't. Ezekiel is one of the strangest, probably the strangest prophet in the Old Testament. He does some bizarre things and says some bizarre things and sees some bizarre things. But the book starts out with the premise that God would leave his people in Judah. The book starts out with the picture of these bizarre-looking angels with eyes, wheels and eyes and foreheads and all kinds of things, but that the glory of God is lifted up by these angels and taken from the Jerusalem temple to Babylon. That the hope of the nation, and the message of this is that the hope of the nation is no longer with these people in Jerusalem. The hope of the nation is with the captives in Babylon, and that's where God is. I don't think it really means that God totally deserts those people in Jerusalem, but it does indicate that the hope of this nation, the future of the nation, is not with the people left in Jerusalem, it's with the people in Babylon, and that's where God is giving his attention. Ezekiel does some strange things and is asked to do some strange things in his life. At one point he takes a brick and he draws a city on the brick. And then he builds a siege mounds against that brick, little dirt mound, little model of a city under siege. And then he lays on one side for a certain length of time and then lays on another side for a certain length of time staring at that brick, indicating how long the northern tribes would be in captivity and how long Judah would be in captivity. And the siege mounds against the brick being an illustration of what would happen in Jerusalem. He does other bizarre things. He cuts his hair one time, and he takes a third of his hair and he throws it up in the air, and he takes a sword and flails away at it. He takes another third and he just scatters it. And then he takes another third and he ties it up inside his apron and saves it. And the message of that symbolic act is that a third of the people would die by the sword, a third of the people would just be scattered everywhere, and a third of the people would be God's remnant, the people that God would watch over and make sure came back to that nation again. Great illustration, except that when you picture him doing it down on the corner of Jerusalem and Damascus Street, it takes on a little bit different picture. You picture maybe a crazy man, but he's a man who's doing what God has called him to do. Oh, God asked him to do one other thing. He says, when your wife dies, don't cry and don't mourn. Because when this nation dies, I won't cry and I won't mourn. So Ezekiel has the task of burying his wife without crying and without mourning. Some of the most beautiful words of hope in the Old Testament prophets are in Ezekiel as well. Ezekiel chapter 34, we won't read that whole chapter, but you really ought to at some point. He talks about the shepherds in Israel and Judah that had led the people astray. And at the end of this chapter, toward the end of the chapter, in verse 23, he says, I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, Yahweh, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. He says, the shepherds that you have now, the kings, the priests, they're worthless. They have led you astray. They've not led you in the worship of Yahweh. They've not led you to worship me. But one day, I'll send you a shepherd of my own choosing, a new David. Now, you and I know that well enough to know that that's Jesus himself. But boy, does that give new meaning to John chapter 10 when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. He's not just saying, I compare myself to the shepherds that you see walking around the land here. He's saying, I'm also the answer, the fulfillment of what God said through Ezekiel that he would provide. The good shepherd. I am the good shepherd, the ultimate shepherd. And Jesus does lay down his life for his sheep and save his sheep. The other chapter that I think is beautiful is one that you're familiar with, at least in song, and that's the Valley of the Dry Bones. God takes Ezekiel out to a valley with none but bones in it. And he says to Ezekiel, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And Ezekiel says, "I don't know. You know." And God says, "Watch." And the bones start hooking together. You know, if I'm going to check out a video in heaven, this is one I want to get. The bones start hooking together. Sinews and muscles come on them, flesh come on them, and these dry bones become living people. You know the song, right? The hip bones connect to the thigh bone, etc., etc. That comes from this passage. But the point of the passage is that God can bring life to those dry bones. And Ezekiel, who's a prophet, by the way, who's living in Babylon, not in Jerusalem. He's in Babylon. He's looking around, and God is saying, "Looks like dry bones to you, doesn't it, Ezekiel? But those bones can live, because I'm God and I can breathe new life into this nation." And he brings the message that God would bring these people home and breathe new life into this nation. That Valley of the Dry Bones, of course, has application on down the line as Ezekiel looks ahead to a Messiah who would come and bring new life to dry bones, to you and me. What a great message. Ezekiel may be a bit strange, but his message is powerful.